Chad Hasty Show, News Talk, KFYO. Thank you very much for tuning in. This morning we go to the phones, and Republican strategist, he's already had a busy morning today. It's Matt Mackowiak joining us. Matt, good morning. How are you?
Morning, Chad. I'm doing great. How about you?
Doing great. Appreciate you joining us today. Let's start off with the Texas Senate race. Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. O'Rourke raising, $38.1 million in the last 3 months. That's a pretty impressive haul. This has now become the most expensive Senate race ever. Is that true?
It is true. It is the most expensive U.S. Senate race in history. This quarter that he raised the $38 million is the largest single quarter of fundraising for a U.S. Senate candidate in either party in history, really kind of swamping the previous record set by Rick Lazio, named from the past, who ran against Hillary Clinton for U.S. Senate in 2000 in New York. I think he raised something like 20 or 22 million at that time. Look, I am going to be very interested tonight. Probably by midnight, we will know how much of that $38 million Beto had to spend to raise $38 million. One of the things very few people have focused on from the last quarter is that Beto raised $10.6 million in the second quarter of the year, but he spent $6 million to raise $10.6 million. It's a pretty high burn rate, 55 or 58%. We'll see if that's what he did here. He would have had to spend, $20 million to have a similar ratio. So may end up only being 10 or 15 million, but it's an amazing amount of money. I think it's now absolutely clear not only that Beto will outraise Cruz, but that he's going to have all the money in the world to do everything he could possibly want to do to try to win this Senate race. I still think the odds are very strongly against him, particularly as Republicans have fully unified behind Cruz. Cruz has ramped up his campaign, and the race has really turned away from personalities and back to issues where it needed to be all along and where Cruz has an advantage.
Yeah, and I've started to see more and more Democrats and some liberal writers here in Texas who are starting to point out flaws in the Beto O'Rourke campaign. You haven't seen that until, the $38 million was announced, and they're like, that's great, but what are you doing? You haven't been able to overcome Cruz, and I think, maybe this was a little bit of high hopes for some of these writers and some of these watchers, but, to me, Ted Cruz has done a great job in the smaller window that he's had actually campaigning. He's done a much better job defining Beto O'Rourke than Beto O'Rourke has done defining Ted Cruz. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And for whatever reason, O'Rourke has remained entirely positive in his race, and that's kind of a naive way to campaign. Generally, elections are choices about two candidates, and he's sort of done this sort of flowery language. Not really putting a lot of substance in there. And the problem for Beto is when he talks about issues, he creates problems for himself. Right. He's done that on law enforcement issues, as I think you've seen, with all the sheriffs endorsing Cruz, his talk of this ridiculous Jim Crow comment he made about how police are treating African Americans. He's created problems for himself on saying he's in favor of impeaching Trump. That's a 30% issue in Texas. That's not how you win elections. You need a majority of the vote, and so taking majority issues is how you win elections. So he doesn't want to do that. He wants to kind of be an Obama-like figure in Texas, and he's remained completely progressive on all the issues, and that is just not where Texas is. He continues to take 30% issues and try to convince a majority electorate that they can need to support him and should elect him to the United States Senate, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, taking a look at other races in Texas and the statewide races, obviously Greg Abbott's going to win. He's going to dominate Lupe Valdez. What about some of the other races? When we look at lieutenant governor, when we look at ag commissioner, we're not hearing a lot about these races. I mean, are these all easy wins for Republicans?
The short answer is yes. I think that the statewide that will have the narrowest margin is probably likely to be the U.S. Senate race, just because O'Rourke is going to have higher name ID than all the other Democrats. And he also, as I said before, has unlimited resources, and resources have always been a major problem for statewide Democratic candidates. If you look, Lupe Valdez has less money in the bank. She couldn't even be running for state senate or even state rep probably with the amount of money she's raising, and she's running for governor in a state of 30 million people. Even if you look down ballot, though, Mike Collier, the Democratic candidate for lieutenant governor, has gotten really no traction whatsoever, is not raising money, is ultimately probably not going to be on television. You go down ballot, it's even worse. The Ag Commission candidate is not in a position to do that. No one knows who's running for comptroller on the Democratic side. Even the candidate running against Land Commissioner George P. Bush, not really doing anything. Look, it's a big state. It's an expensive state. Their candidates are people who've never been elected to anything, primarily, with the exception of Beto. And when you don't have name ID to start, you don't have a fundraising base to start, you don't have an organization to start, it is an enormous challenge to run statewide in Texas. People do not realize how big the state is, with 21 media markets, with at least one local television station and one daily newspaper. It just takes an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of time. And unfortunately for the Democrats, they recruited a weak slate of candidates. They pretended it was strong, but ultimately it's proven to be pretty weak. And so, no, the statewide races are not going to be close. And the Democrats are really focusing their money and their time and their focus on down-ballot legislative races for State House and State Senate and Congress primarily.
Are we going to start seeing, that there were the national Republicans and some of these groups and PACs were starting to shift their money into Texas? I know with only a few weeks to go, I don't know how much money is going to make a difference in other states. Do you anticipate that some of these groups are going to shift money out of Texas and put it into Pennsylvania and put it into some of these other states where, there's some House seats that are up for grabs and some Senate seats that are maybe up for grabs?
So the short answer is yes. You've already seen some of the Republican groups take money out of the San Antonio congressional race with Will Hurd because they're so confident he's winning, and he's winning by a pretty strong margin. What he's doing in that district is remarkable in terms of how strong he is. So you're actually seeing Republicans lead the way in terms of moving resources away. I think Democrats, if they haven't already, will follow very quickly. I think the Sessions and Culberson races in Dallas and Houston, respectively, will probably be focused on by both sides all the way to the end. They appear to both be pretty close. I still think the Republicans are more likely than not to win both of those seats, but it's going to be a question of how strong the Democratic performance is across Dallas County and Harris County, whether Sessions and Culberson get swept up in those waves. But look, other than that, those are the three congressional races that are getting a lot of outside money. The sort of in-state, state rep and state House, state Senate races are getting a lot of in-state money. So certainly, resources are being moved around based on dynamics and based on where people think their resources can make the biggest difference. But the only real movement we've seen so far is in that San Antonio congressional seat. So I'm not sure we're going to see much more movement in terms of national money.
I know it's way too early to take any of these polls seriously, but CNN had their first Democratic 2020 poll, and Joe Biden leading that poll with I think 33% support. Beto O'Rourke actually was in the top 10 with like 2% support among national Democrats. Did you have any thought? Do you really think Joe Biden's going to be the guy standing at the end of the day, or do you think the left is going to want somebody like an Elizabeth Warren, like a Bernie Sanders, who will bring the more Democrat socialism into the mix?
Oh man, it's impossible to say. The Democrats are in a very strange place right now. They're really, kind of contending with this rabid left-wing base that is pulling their party way outside the mainstream and endangering their chances to win major elections in key races, and I think nationally. I think what's happening in the Democratic Party may ultimately put Trump in a position where he can win re-election, even though he's had, generally poor approval numbers through most of his first 2 years. So, look, I think right now that poll is a name ID poll. I mean, It's basically just showing that people know who Biden is. They don't know who some of these senators are. That'll change over time. The Democratic field is going to be 15, 20, maybe 25 people running. It's going to be unwieldy. I think that there's probably a top tier of 3 or 4 people. I think Elizabeth Warren has a massive fundraising base and could be a strong candidate in the Democratic primary. Joe Biden certainly could be a strong candidate. He has not run well the last 2 times he's run for president, but he's now obviously a former vice president. Bernie Sanders, if he runs, would have a good base and a good fundraising base. Kamala Harris, the Democratic senator from California, I think could be a force as well. So, look, it's going to be a wild Democratic primary for 2020, and let's be honest, Chad, it's not that early. These candidates are already running. Cory Booker from New Jersey's already been to Iowa. A number of the other candidates are going to Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. So and I should add, Mike Bloomberg, the mayor of New York City, is likely running. Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks, is likely running. I mean, there are going to be so many people running. It's going to be very hard to get oxygen in that Democratic primary.
Well, and what? Elizabeth Warren basically announced today that she's running with this DNA test that she announced and the Boston Globe announced. I mean, that's the only reason she would be putting that out there is for 2020, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's right. She didn't want to go through this. She doesn't think that those questions are reasonable to begin with, but clearly they've made a difference, and she felt it was necessary to do that. Now, she may also be in a due diligence phase where her team is having her do everything that she should do in case she wants to run, and she could always at the last minute choose not to run. And honestly, she and Bernie Sanders pull from the same donor base, the same activist base, the same voter base. I'm not sure that both of them can run and both be strong. I think they might both weaken each other if they both run. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to watch as well.
Yeah, very nice. Matt, tell folks how they can sign up for your newsletter and what your podcast topic is over.
Yeah, we produce a morning weekday email called Must Read Texas that goes to 3,000 Texans every morning with the top news from around the state. It's very clearly and cleanly delivered to your inbox. You can sign up for a free 1-week trial at mustreadtexas.com. And the podcast that I've got is called Mac on Politics. We're up to 103 episodes now. The most recent episode is with former independent counsel Ken Starr, who has some fascinating insight, both into his experience investigating the Clintons, but also into the Mueller inquiry related to Russian meddling. So you can find that in iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and on the web at maconpoliticspodcast.com.
Very interesting. Matt, as always, appreciate your time. We'll visit with you next week.
Thanks, Chad. Take care.
You have a good one. That's Matt Mackowiak, and you can follow him on Twitter as well, at Matt Mackowiak.